Hello, I'm Flip Padot. Welcome back to Old Bull, and welcome to the home stretch of the first in the nation Iowa caucus, where Bernie Sanders is surging just in time. Meanwhile, the Senate holds a somniferous trial. Bolton rocks the boat, Romney waffles, and we dare 538 to play Are You Dumber Than a Prediction Market? I'm glad you joined us. Now let's shoot the bull. So let's start by taking a look at the latest price action on a few contracts on leading prediction market PredictIt. One that isn't really seeing a ton of volume yet, but should start to get really interesting as actual voting gets underway, is the Democratic vice presidential nomination. While the nomination itself looks all but certain to go to one of three elderly white males, the top 6 VP prospects at the moment are all women. From the top, you've got Kamala Harris, who says she's weighing a Biden endorsement, followed by Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, a state Democrats really need to hold on to, where Hillary only won by 1.5%. In third is Stacey Abrams, most notable for being allegedly cheated out of the 2018 gubernatorial race in Georgia, which would be a good pickup for Dems, where they only lost by 5 points in 2016. At fourth is Tulsi Gabbard, the Democratic gadfly, whose name is practically a dirty word and probably doesn't belong anywhere on this list. Next up is Elizabeth Warren, who you know, and who, like Harris and Klobuchar, may owe her rank here more to her general prominence in the presidential contest than viability as a running mate. Number 6 is Nina Turner, a Sanders campaign co-chair from Ohio, which Clinton lost by 8 points, but most polls show Sanders narrowly leading. If Bernie manages to win both Iowa and New Hampshire, as looks increasingly likely, look for her stock to potentially rise. Mayor Pete gets an honorable mention at number 7, but given that his home state of Indiana was lost by 20 points by the Democrats in 2016, not sure that he's going to rise much above where he is. To me, Nina Turner looks like the most and possibly only interesting pick on this board. Speaking of Sanders, he is sitting pretty going into Iowa based on recent polling and is now the strong, if not yet overwhelming favorite to win both states. He took a narrow lead over Biden this week in terms of the odds to win the overall nomination, and if things break his way, that lead could widen a bunch. And now, of course, we are a whole week into the third presidential impeachment trial in history, and just the second in living memory. Even if Senators Inhofe and Risch have no memory of the proceedings, traitors certainly have been watching. But with House Manager's case pretty well aired out by now, most of the noteworthy action has been outside the Senate chamber. Notably, former National Security Advisor and Adam Schiff's last best hope, John Bolton, leaked parts of his unpublished manuscript alleging that Trump told him he wanted aid to Ukraine tied to an announcement that the country was investigating the Bidens. This, just as Mitt Romney says that he'll likely vote to hear from more witnesses, which was accompanied by a spike in the odds that he would actually vote to convict Trump in the trial, a spike which also dragged up the odds of Murkowski's and Collins voting to convict. Odds are still against any Republican taking Trump up on his head on a pike offer, but things are edging slightly in that direction. So, what is the upshot of all this upheaval on Trump's re-election odds? Basically nothing. The market for which party wins the White House has long been one of the least volatile on the site, unfazed not only by impeachment and its 24/7 coverage, but by brinksmanship in the Mideast, historic trade deals, the rise and fall of vastly different candidates for the Democratic nomination, and the only thing that this chart does seem to track is the economy. In particular, the financial markets. Over the last 90 days, for every percent stocks have gone up, and they've gone up a bunch, Trump gains by about a half penny in his re-elect price. From late October through late January, the markets rose about 10%, and Republicans' odds of winning the White House in 2020 rose from 48 to 53, or 5 points. Now markets give back a couple percent, as they have over the last few days, and Trump's lead over the generic Democratic opponent goes back a point. So whether or not you buy our take on what is moving this market, the daily doings on Capitol Hill and the campaign trail plainly are not. But just because the president's odds of re-election are apparently carved in stone doesn't mean there aren't other ways to play impeachment theater in these markets. In addition to those moderate Democrats voting to convict markets that we just looked at, you can also get in on Bolton testifying. This is far from a sure thing, but at 38 or 39 cents, it seems like a very attractive prospect with the potential for a double within a couple of days, especially if Romney's gambit manages to pull in a couple more Republican votes to call additional witnesses. All right, let's get to today's guest. one we are very excited about. He's a statistics professor who studies the relative forecasting accuracy of prediction markets versus that of professional forecasters and data journalists. The most famous, of course, being Nate Silver of 538. Now, Silver says prediction markets represent the dumb money and competitive mansplaining, which is proven to suck. Is he right? Or just nervous about the worth of his stock in trade? Harry Crane is the associate professor and co-director of the graduate program in statistics at Rutgers University, and he joins us now. Dr. Crane, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Hey, how you doing?
So this is a topic you've actually been lending your statistical talents to and trying to answer this age-old question of, do prediction markets work? Do they better forecast future events than prevailing methods, in particular celebrated, data journalists, sabermetricians, whatever else they call them, effectively the 538s of the world? And before you reveal the answer, just to revisit some of the context here, 538's Nate Silver doesn't have much use for prediction markets. They're what he calls the dumb money, and that's a slight he actually repeated earlier this week. But of course, he has an incentive to denigrate them. They constitute a substitute product. If a bunch of dumb traders can outperform him, then what is the point of him? And I have to say, it probably shouldn't be a surprise to anyone with a passing familiarity of how markets work if they do turn out to perform as well or better than any other forecasting source, because of course markets aggregate all available information. And so if the markets are efficient, then they should impute all the information and analysis that Nate Silver in 538 does, even if they weren't publicized, even if they weren't actually doing that analysis. But particularly because they do publish them in a quantitative and ongoing way, that information should quickly become baked into PredictIt and other prediction market prices. But that's not the case. The prices on PredictIt don't snap to 538's forecast. They actually pretty frequently diverge in material ways. So the mind of the market, it would seem, does operate differently from that of Nate Silver and his ilk. And so if one does believe that markets are efficient, and for all kinds of reasons predicted markets are not fully efficient, the $850 limit, finite liquidity spread across hundreds of markets, certain elements of the contracts and the fee structure that can skew the numbers. But if you believe that they're at least weakly efficient, then you have to believe that they're in fact to some extent rejecting the analysis that 538 puts out, at least in some cases. And so to me, this is almost self-evident. In other words, if 538 outperforms the market consistently, then anyone can quickly get rich, using 538's forecast to beat the market, which obviously has not happened because we don't see the prices snap to 538's viewpoint. So that much, I think, doesn't take a sabermetrician to understand, but the rest of this segment might, which is why we have you here with us, Dr. Crane. And so I think in order to understand how we compare probabilistic forecasts and the various methodologies, can you, before getting into what your studies have revealed in terms of which does better, give us a general sense of sort of the vocabulary and the methods here? What are we looking at when we try to answer the question of which set of forecasts is more predictive, is more accurate?
Well, thanks for that. I'm surprised to hear that he actually said that again. You're saying earlier this week. I wasn't aware of that, and curious to hear the context. But so this is actually the one of the questions that I set out to kind of understand for myself. So my work is more generally in probability theory in general, and in particular, what does probability even mean? And so what first got me thinking about these election forecasting was back in the 2016 election. I was hearing about, and a lot of people were talking the probabilities or the forecasts on 538, and I would look at it myself. I don't read the site regularly, but I started to look at it, and I had a hard time actually trying to make sense of what these probabilities actually mean. I mean, you have somebody who has all these models, he's cranking through data, he's cranking through polls. By no means is there no information. I mean, there's certainly some information in those models, but I wanted to know what that forecast actually means. He says 60% or 70%. At the end of the day, what usually happens is the election happens and somebody wins and somebody loses. And the way that it's usually assessed, or it's been assessed by Nate Silver and others, is if you were above 50% on the event that happened, you predicted it right. And if you were below 50%, then you predicted it wrong. But obviously, that kind of defeats the purpose of this 0 to 1 scale. So I started to think a bit more about that, and I couldn't make much of it because in order to think about this the right way, you have to have kind of some predefined metric as far as what are we measuring here? What do these probabilities measure, and how do we grade them after the events occur? And so there's really two predominant ways to do that, or at least that we can talk about. I'm going to talk about the ones that 538 actually refers to, and that Silver himself likes to talk about, because I did see the other day that they have posted something on there recently about how they fare against, in terms of some of these metrics over the past 5-10 years or so, in all of their different categories, politics, and so on. And so really the first one is something that's called calibration. And this is what Nate Silver himself likes to bring up a lot. At least I've heard him talk. I've seen it. He writes about it. He talks about it, and it's on their website. Which is a simple idea. Which is, when I say that something has a 20% probability, it should happen roughly 20% of the time. And so what you do is you aggregate all of the forecasts that I've made over the past 10, 20, 5-10 years, whatever. There might be, let's say, 1,000 times that I predicted something with a 15% probability. Then about 150 of those particular events should have actually happened, and the rest of them should not have happened because I was only given it a 15% chance. And you do this for each of the numbers, in essence, between 0 and 1, each of the possible probabilities. And you see how well calibrated. When I say that something has a 20% chance, does it happen 20% of the time? And that's the concept of calibration.
Right. So this seems like an important but probably limited measure, right? I mean, if I know that here in New York it rains, 15% of the days in any given year, give or take, and if I, for a decade, make the same prediction every morning that there's a 15% chance of rain, I'll be almost perfectly well calibrated, right? But there's absolutely no information that goes into my forecast other than the fact that I know that over time it rains about 15% of the time.
Yeah, and here's the problem with calibration, and one that I don't even think it should be talked about actually in this context, because you can actually guarantee yourself to be calibrated without having, and I mean, there you actually matched your 15% to the historical record. Take something like, simplest case, 2016 election, presidential election, 2 candidates, Trump and Clinton. One of them's going to win and one of them's going to lose. If I just say that they each have a 50% chance to win, then exactly 50% of my 50% forecast will be true because one of them will win, and 50% of them will be false because one of them will lose. And you can always guarantee yourself to be calibrated in that exact way. Right now, I don't know if there's 6, 10, 20 Democratic candidates left, whatever you want to call it. If you give each one the exact same probability of winning the nomination, you're guaranteed that 1 out of 20 will win and 19 out of 20 will lose, and you will be perfectly calibrated.
Right. So it seems that you want to be well calibrated. In other words, if you are under, if you're predicting everything with a 70% chance and all those things happen, you probably should have been predicting them with a higher percentage chance. So it maybe is a measure of your over or under confidence, but it doesn't really necessarily say much about your accuracy relative to an informed prediction that does not include your analysis.
Well, that's the other word that gets used in this context is accuracy, and that's how close was your prediction to the truth. So calibration is the metric that's commonly. It's really the first metric that Silver likes to use, and I guess it's the simplest one to understand. I mean, you say something at X%, it should happen X% of the time, but it's not really something that is worth. It's really not worth anything in the end because of what we just talked about, how you can guarantee yourself to be calibrated without any information except the number of candidates in the race. The key, the operative concept really is accuracy. How close are the forecasts to the truth? So this is where we can distinguish between a 99% probability and a 51% probability. If the event happens, the 99% was a lot closer to the truth than the 51%. If the event doesn't happen, then the 51% was closer to the truth, and so you could say that that was more accurate. And this is where this is the right kind of measurement or the right concept to start to get a handle on, how in assessing some of these forecasts. And so this is the thing that I tried to start looking at in 2018. I started analyzing it a little bit close to the election, so I didn't get kind of the full cycle of data in. But we're gonna be picking up on this, I think, soon on the 2020. So I've been talking to some students and some people who are interested in this, and we're hoping to give a pretty thorough comparison between the prediction markets and the 538 and maybe other pundit type of forecasters in terms of how well they do in this case. So what I proposed in 2018, which is a little bit different from calibration or accuracy, but it obviously gets at the accuracy of a forecast, which is, I'm looking at these markets, and at that time it was the 2018, so it was a midterm. I was looking at the Senate and House races, and there's plenty of instances where the predicted price is 10, 20, 25 cents different than the 538 forecast. And I just looked yesterday at the Democratic primary numbers. If you look at South Carolina, for example, I think Biden on 538 has something like a 56% chance, whereas PredictIt's given him in the high 70s. So if you're looking at these 538 numbers and you think that they have merit and there is information in them, like I've said, but there's a 20 cent discrepancy here. There's money to be made. So I guess what I set out to look at was, well, let's say you actually thought you wanted to kind of buy into these markets according to the 538 forecast. This is all you used to price these markets, and anytime you saw value, you bought the contract accordingly. Who would do better? And in that particular case, I think that the results were actually a little bit inconclusive. In the Senate race, the PredictIt outperformed 538, whereas in the House, 538 outperformed PredictIt, but it was close either way. But I guess really what's kind of, so I published that analysis on my webpage, and I talked about it a bit on Twitter. And Nate Silver himself actually responded to this and started to criticize it and make fun of how stupid the analysis was. And he starts to talk about just the House. He says, we would have been betting big money on the House races, but not the Senate race. Right. Well, how can you magically see that, well, we would have bet more on the House than the Senate, even though we have predictions on both, but we would have been winning in the House. So obviously those are the ones we would have been putting money on. And this kind of bugs me about the analysis, the kind of stuff that you would read on that site, which is there is no kind of concrete, this is what we're trying to do, and this is how you should assess how good we were at doing it. There's always the fallback of, to every number that they post, there's how many articles that they write about it, and they discuss all of the various ways in which their number might be right or wrong. And they always have that to fall back on when something goes wrong. They say, I was just looking at this from November 8th, 2016. I remembered this because I happened to read it at the time. I guess was that election day. It was before the election. I think it might have been election day. But it says, final election update. There's a wide range of outcomes, and most of them come up Clinton. And he goes on to discuss, I guess, what's going to happen. But then there's always, I've compared it to like the way that a fortune teller will interact with you. They give you, well, this is going to be your lucky year, but you might have some unfortunate accidents, so be careful. So no matter what happens, they said the right thing, because then he goes on and says, well, polls are good, but not perfect. And then he says polling errors are correlated across states and could put Clinton at risk or put red states in play. So, I mean, you're saying things that in principle are true, but you're also playing both sides of it. And that's something that what I appreciate about the prediction markets, and what your last guest also said at some point was, all of this you can say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you buy a contract on one side or the other, you have a profit or a loss, and there's never it's hard to debate that, right? The 538, where I think the 538 predictions are accurate, or more accurate, is going to be in the more extreme cases. I don't necessarily agree or believe that the 538 probabilities are correct when they assign 99.99% to a particular outcome, because they do that in cases like, Elizabeth Warren win in Massachusetts. Of course, she's very likely to win, but to say that that's a 1 in 10,000 event, right? A lot of things that could happen in a month, between now and election day. I'm giving an example of the case of a Senate race, winning Massachusetts Senate, that could mean that she's not going to win, right? And so 90.99% is probably too high, but 94% or 95%, which is the typical number you'll see on PredictIt until the very end, is probably too low. And there's reasons for that. And there's the transaction cost, I think, is the big thing. And also, there's always a long shot bias usually in these types of markets. So
the transaction. There's a transaction cost, and I think an opportunity cost too, where you have traders, especially leading into elections, with a lot of markets to play and a lot of potential temporary mispricing that they might want to capitalize on. And is it worth it for a typical trader with the bankroll to do so, to sit on a market for 4%? To normal investors, 4% over a couple of weeks sounds great, but when these are traders that are looking to get in on something at 50, 60 cents to snap to $1, they might not be willing to correct that long shot bias that would show still a 4% chance maybe of an underdog victory, whereas the correct odds are probably less than 1%.
I guess the thing that I remembered also before 2018 was there was some discussion about, one was Silver had said he doesn't account for the prediction markets in his own analysis. That's not part of the 538 analysis. And he said the reason is because his price is already used to price in is already priced into the markets. And so it would be kind of like a circular thing, although based on obviously the things you said earlier and what some people are finding, I think there's a question as to how much. I'm sure the 538 stuff is being looked at by these traders, as everything is being looked at by these traders. But the extent to which the market moves when 538 releases something new, that obviously is not so clear because of the huge discrepancy in prices. But he was also asked by whoever else was on the show whether or not he was participating. And kind of, since there's such a discrepancy, was he participating in these markets? And he actually said that it would be unethical for him to participate.
That's convenient.
Which is an interesting. I mean, it's the total opposite code of ethics that I would imagine that and you're putting stuff out there as if it's kind of a fact of the world in some sense. And yet you're not held accountable at all to the extent that it's that it's wrong. And so that was something that I've written about that in other contexts as well, not just in political predictions, but also in scientific publication in general. You're using these probabilities are these slippery things that that can be used. I said that it had a 25% chance and then it happened. Well, I didn't say it couldn't happen. I said 25%. You can always kind of slide out the back door, because as long as you give something a non-zero or non-extreme probability, you've given it some chance of happening. And I think that that's the way that some people interpret and understand these things. And that's where the markets definitely hold your feet to the fire. And that's something that I've written about in what I call the fundamental principle of probability, which is if you say something has 20% chance, then you should be willing to offer, whatever the right odds are, 4-to-1 odds to actually bet on whether or not that happens. Otherwise, how am I supposed to make sense of or put any value in the words that you just said? So that's something that I think is missing from the analysis on these websites in 538. And I think that's something that's important to understand. I think it's something that traders intuitively understand and are doing, they're living this out on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, it's something that I think could be talked about a bit more.
Well, Dr. Crean, thanks so much for joining us and for your insights. Can you tell us where our viewers can go to follow along with your work?
Well, for this stuff, I'll be talking about it a lot on Twitter. My name is Harry D. Crane. And I've also published stuff in the past, and I'll be publishing the work on my publishing website, which is Researchers One. Researchers.one is the URL. So you can check that out. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Direct message is usually the best way. Email is also okay.
Great. So researchers.one for your academic research, and Harry D. Crane on Twitter. I want to thank you again for coming on. Of course, we did also invite Nate Silver from 538. We have yet to get a response, but if he ever does, maybe we can have you back on and pit the two of you against each other.
No, it sounds like fun.
Fabulous. Thanks for joining us, Harry. Speak to you soon.
All right. Talk to you later.
And since Silver refuses to put his money where his sabermetrics are and prove he's less dumb than traders, we've decided to do it for him in our new weekly segment, Models versus Markets. Now, this is going to be fun. This is your reward for sticking around for the whole Crane interview. In Models versus Markets, we use 538's latest forecast to build actual live portfolios to exploit what their model says are mispriced contracts on prediction market PredictIt. With the Democratic primaries and caucuses now set to begin, our first portfolio will involve the races in the first 4 states: Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. In each of those states, you have 4 candidates with non-negligible odds of winning, which gives us 16 outcomes, each of which we can bet on or against. So really there are 32 choices in where we allocate our money. So we put $100 in a PredictIt account just for the occasion. And to build this Clash of the Titans portfolio, we use the same Kelly criterion that Professor Crane discussed. This is a method devised by John Kelly at Bell Labs in the 1950s, if you're curious, which takes a set of probabilistic forecasts, in this case 538's odds of each candidate winning each of these states, and uses them to exploit what those forecasts indicate to be inefficient pricing, in other words, odds that are too long or too short, being offered on those outcomes, whether by a bookmaker, a casino, or in this case, a prediction market. So if 538 says Biden will win Iowa and PredictIt shows Sanders leading, you'd buy both Biden to win and Sanders not to win. But it goes further than that. If both sources say Sanders will win, but PredictIt's price, in other words, Sanders' likelihood out of 100 is higher than 538's odds, you'd actually still buy Sanders not to win. Even though PredictIt traders in that instance would be agreeing Sanders is most likely to win, if 538's lower odds are set correctly, then you'd be overpaying to go long Sanders. So instead, you want to scoop up that relative bargain on the odds of his not winning. The larger the discrepancy between the forecaster's odds and the market price, the greater percentage of your bankroll it prescribes allocating to each position. Now, Kelly technically envisions making each of these bets in sequence rather than doing all in a batch. So this is not a perfect implementation of the criterion, but should still be about as good a method as any to determine if there is actual, actionable, useful intelligence in 538's ballyhooed work product beyond what the dumb mansplainers spit out via their trading activity. Now, we made our initial allocations based on this criterion last Wednesday, January 22nd at around 10 a.m., at which point these were 538's and PredictIt's odds for the top 4 candidates in the first 4 states. You can see that some of the discrepancies were significant, and in only half the states did PredictIt and 538 even agree on the identity of the frontrunner. So unless 538 is useless, there is money to be made here. Specifically, and here's the math part, Kelly tells us that the fraction of our bankroll to invest in a proposition calculated as F prime should be B times P minus Q over B, where B is the net odds being offered, P is the actual or alleged odds of the proposition happening, in our case taken from 538, and Q is the odds that it doesn't happen, or 1 minus P. The result was this. Behold, 538's PredictIt shopping list as of 10 a.m. on January 22nd. You'll notice we're betting against every frontrunner, a theme we'll come back to in a minute, most heavily against Biden in South Carolina and Sanders in New Hampshire. 538 actually has these two leading those respective states, although they had it as nearly a four-way tie in New Hampshire, bizarrely. But the point is, PredictIt is showing the frontrunners as consistently stronger than 538 is. In other words, the market says there's much less chance of an upset. Kelly, in turn, tells us that if 538 is smarter, we need to load up on those underpriced underdogs and fade the hell out of the frontrunners. So that's what we did. We weren't able to fill every position at the last trade price used to calculate the Kelly allocations, which led to a leakage of $3.52 in constructing the portfolio, so we'll later synthetically add that back so that 538 is not unfairly dinged for the bid-ask spread. So it's been a few days since we unleashed the full fury of 538's soothsaying on PredictIt, and how are we doing so far? Not well. We are not doing well. Let's start in Iowa, where caucus goers are getting ready to caucus go. Traders have Sanders as a weak front runner at 45% to win and have since moved him up to 60%. So our short position here is as guided by 538's forecast that Sanders only had a 23% chance, killing us. 538's updated forecast has begrudgingly moved him up to a coin flip with Biden. So silver is moving in PredictIt's direction, but traders have been days to weeks ahead of 538 on this, and it is wrecking our portfolio. Things are even worse in New Hampshire, where 538 said Biden and Sanders were equally likely, just below 30. PredictIt had Sanders much higher at 57, so naturally we bet big against him. But since then, his odds have only gone higher, now 75%. 538 here again begrudgingly moves towards PredictIt's number, just much more slowly. They've moved Sanders up from 29 to 41%, still way below PI's forecast. And how about our biggest position? Going against Biden in South Carolina, where PredictIt traders gave him an 81% chance of victory and 538 only 63%. Here we're actually up a little, as Biden's PredictIt price has dwindled from 81% to 75%, still a strong favorite, but less overwhelmingly so. And finally, in Nevada, we are getting pummeled for going against the co-front runners Sanders and Biden. 538 had this as a pretty competitive four-way race when we took our positions, whereas PredictIt was showing a clear two-man race. Traders have only grown in their conviction since then, pushing Sanders and Biden's combined price to well over 90% and bleeding yet more money from our coffers. And here we see the same dynamic over the last several days. 538 is gradually following PredictIt's price, but much more slowly and with less conviction. And those are the kinds of insights or counter insights that Kelly is meant to capture. You need to not only be right, but to be more right, more accurate in terms of your level of conviction, and you need to get there before the counterpart that you're trading against. So this could still go a lot of ways, of course, and we will continue to update you on the portfolio's performance. For now, if you like 538's forecast, you'd still feel very good about the current positions. Were you to rerun the model today, you'd arrive at slightly different allocations, but the themes are the same. If PredictIt is right, then 538 is undervaluing Bernie in 3 out of 4 states, but it may not be a Bernie thing, but rather a frontrunner thing. The one state where 538 is undervaluing Biden, assuming PredictIt is right, is South Carolina, where Biden is the favorite. So the common theme across every state is that 538 is more mealy-mouthed, weaker of conviction, and tending more toward that easy intro-race calibration that Dr. Crane discussed, where all candidates would have a 1/n chance of victory. That doesn't mean the 538 is wrong. If the frontrunner status in each of these races is more tenuous than traders think, there's a good chance that one or more of the increasingly out-of-favor predictions in our portfolio will hit pay dirt and generate an outsized gain. But for now, the 538 model is taking it on the chin and hemorrhaging money. If you would like to play along at home, we will post the spreadsheet showing the current odds of both 538 and PredictIt in these races, along with the calculation of the current optimal allocation on oldbull.tv. So check that out if you like 538's forecasts and want to use it to scalp the PredictIt rubes. In the meantime, we'd like to reiterate our invitation to Mr. Silver or any of his compatriots to join us and offer their perspective on the early primaries and the predictive capacity of models versus markets. That's all we've got for you today. Be sure to check out next week's episode when we'll sit down with Joey Krug, the co-founder of the Augur Project, a fully decentralized blockchain-based prediction market. We may also do some kind of live stream on Iowa Caucus Night next Monday, but do not hold us to that. Either way, make sure to subscribe to this channel while you're here so you don't miss out on any of it. And if you're listening to the audio version, come join us at oldbull.tv to subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at oldbulltv for the equally indispensable content we simply can't squeeze into the broadcast. We will see you next time. Thanks for joining us.